Silas Crowder didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door to the county land office like he owned the building, which, in a way, he'd been working toward for years. He almost did. He dropped a leather folder onto the clerk's desk, hard enough to rattle the ink bottles, and he said, without looking at anyone in particular, "I want that valley surveyed and auctioned before the snow comes." The clerk looked up. "Sir, the Marlowe deed is still in probate. Her father's been in the ground 3 weeks." Silas finally looked at him. "File the restriction." That one sentence, that one cold, unhurried sentence, spoken not in anger but in the flat tone of a man who had already decided how this would end, was the moment everything changed for 29-year-old Eliza Marlowe. She wasn't in the room, she didn't hear it, but she would feel it by morning. If someone tried to take everything your father built, everything you bled for, and the law told you there was nothing you could do, what would you do? Before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And after you've watched, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Raven Creek, Montana, and let's meet a woman who refused to disappear quietly. The morning after her father's funeral, Eliza Marlowe woke up before the sun and went to check on the cattle. Not because anyone told her to, not because there was a hand left on the payroll who expected her to show up. She went because the cattle needed water and the troughs needed breaking. It had dropped below freezing overnight. And because standing still in that house with all of her father's things still exactly where he'd left them was something she couldn't do yet. She worked for 2 hours before she allowed herself to go back inside. She made coffee. She sat down at the kitchen table where her father used to go over the account ledgers every Sunday evening, and she opened the folder the county solicitor had left with her the day before. She'd been putting it off. She knew, vaguely, that there were legal matters. She had not known how bad. It took her 20 minutes to read through everything, partly because her hands kept going still, and she had to make herself start again. The territorial restriction was real. She'd heard older ranchers mention it once or twice over the years. Some relic of the early settlement laws, back when the territory was still being carved out, and somebody in a government office had decided that property of significant acreage needed a male household head to ensure stable stewardship. Nobody had enforced it in a decade. Most people assumed it had been quietly forgotten. It hadn't been forgotten. It had been waiting, and someone had filed a formal notice invoking it against her estate within 72 hours of her father's death. She didn't need to read the name on the filing to know whose it was, but she read it anyway. Silas Crowder. Crowder, Land and Cattle, Raven Creek County. She sat with that for a long time. The coffee went cold. Outside, one of the horses made a low sound in the barn, and the wind picked up and rattled the north window the way it always did when the weather was thinking about turning. Eliza Marlowe was not a woman who cried easily. She'd learned early that tears on a cattle ranch accomplished approximately nothing, and her father, God rest him, had been a practical man who raised a practical daughter. But sitting there in that kitchen, reading that name on that paper, she felt something behind her eyes that she had to breathe very deliberately to push back down. She was not going to lose this land. She did not yet know how she was going to keep it, but she was not going to lose it. The county solicitor's name was Mr. Harlan, and he was a decent man in the way that decent men sometimes are, well-meaning but ultimately helpless against the machinery of what was legal versus what was right. He received Eliza in his office that same afternoon and spread the documents across his desk with the careful, apologetic precision of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "The restriction is legitimate," he said. "I've checked the territorial code 3 times. It applies to parcels above 200 acres with active livestock operations. Your father's holding qualifies on both counts." "My father's holding is my holding now." Eliza kept her voice even. "He left it to me in his will." "He did, and the will is valid, but the restriction—" Harlan paused, adjusted his glasses. "The restriction doesn't concern the will, Miss Marlowe. It concerns the operation of the property going forward. Without a qualifying male household partner, the county board has the authority to place the deed in contested status. Contested status, which means it can be auctioned after 30 days if the restriction isn't satisfied." Eliza looked at him steadily. "And who filed the notice?" Harlan looked at his desk. "I think you know." "I want to hear you say it." He said it. She nodded once, slowly, like she was filing it somewhere permanent inside herself. And if I satisfy the restriction, if I produce this qualifying household partner before the 30 days are up, then the contest is invalid and the deed transfers cleanly to your name. How long do I have? He looked at his calendar. 9 days. The board meets on the 10th. Eliza stood up, picked up her hat from the chair beside her, and walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. Mr. Harlan, she said, without turning around, is there anything about this law that isn't completely disgraceful? Harlan was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I don't believe there is. She spent 2 days thinking, not panicking, thinking. There was a difference, and Eliza knew it, because panic was what happened when you stopped sorting through the facts and started letting the fear run the table. She could not afford fear right now. Fear was a luxury for people who had options. She was down to one. She went through the men she knew, not romantically, practically. The way you'd inventory fence posts before a hard winter, who was reliable, who didn't already owe something to Silas Crowder, who wouldn't, the moment a legal signature was dry, start treating her land like his land. That last criterion eliminated most of the list faster than she expected. Raven Creek was not a large community. It was the kind of town where everybody knew which families were in debt to which bank, and which bank Silas Crowder had quiet arrangements with. Several men who might have been willing were also men who'd borrowed money from Crowder affiliates, or who sold cattle through Crowder's buyers, or whose fathers had shaken hands on agreements Eliza wasn't fully privy to. She trusted exactly none of them to stand up if Silas came calling. On the evening of the second, she was walking back from the south pasture when she passed the blacksmith shop at the edge of town and saw a light still burning inside. She'd seen Calder Voss around Raven Creek for years without thinking much about him. That wasn't an insult. It was simply the truth. He was one of those men who occupied a space without demanding you notice him. He ran horses on a homestead north of the ridge, did occasional work for the blacksmith in town during lean months, kept to himself in the particular way of someone who'd learned that being left alone was worth more than most things people tried to sell you. Nobody had anything bad to say about him. Nobody had much of anything to say about him at all, which was, she realized, standing in the street with the cold coming down and 7 days left on a 30-day clock, exactly what she needed. She walked into the shop. I was working on a hinge, bent over the anvil with the focused stillness of someone who'd been at this long enough that it didn't require thought, just attention. He looked up when she came in. Didn't startle. Didn't immediately start talking, the way most men did when a woman appeared unexpectedly. He just looked at her and waited. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. I need a husband before Saturday, she said. A legal one. On paper. For 30 days, maybe 60. Long enough to satisfy the county board's restriction on my land. The hinge sat on the anvil between them. Somewhere behind Calder, something ticked and cooled. He studied her for a long moment, not the way men sometimes studied her, with that particular assessment she'd learned to recognize and dislike. More the way he'd been looking at the hinge, like he was determining what the situation actually required. What kind of arrangement are you proposing? He said. Equal, clean. My land stays mine. Your homestead stays yours. We share a roof when county inspectors require it, which I'm told will be twice. We maintain the household appearance long enough for the deed to transfer without contest. She paused. At the end, we file for dissolution on the grounds of mutual incompatibility. Nobody gets anything from anyone. Nobody owes anybody anything. It's a business agreement with a legal structure. He was quiet. I'm not asking you to play a part, she said. I'm asking you to sign a document and not be dishonest about it. Why me? The question landed simply, without ego or fishing. He genuinely wanted to know. Because, Eliza said, you're the only man in Raven Creek I'm reasonably sure won't try to take something from me the moment you have legal standing to. Calder looked at her for another few seconds. Then he set down the tool in his hand and straightened up. When do we sign? He said. The news moved through Raven Creek the way news always moved through a small town, faster than anyone could have carried it on foot, and with details that bore only passing resemblance to reality. By the morning after their simple county signing, half the town thought it was a romance, a third thought it was a scheme, and the remaining fraction reserved judgment, which in Eliza's experience was the most honest response. She didn't much care what people thought. She cared what Silas Crowder thought. She found out when his foreman, a thick-necked man named Dorsey, rode past the ranch gate 3 days after the signing at a pace that wasn't quite slow enough to be accidental and gave the property a long, flat look before continuing on down the road. It was a message. Not a threat. Not yet. More like the way a man checks to see if the door he expected to find unlocked has been bolted. It had been bolted. But Eliza knew Silas well enough, knew his type anyway, which was a sufficient substitute, to understand that a bolted door wasn't a stopped man. It was just an inconvenience that needed a different approach. She didn't say any of this to Calder. Their arrangement didn't include her anxieties. What she said was, "The inspectors will come within the first 2 weeks. They'll want to see evidence of shared household operation. I have a room prepared in the East Wing. You'll need to keep some of your things there." "All right," Calder said. "The cattle rotation schedule is on the wall by the kitchen door. You don't have to follow it. It's there if you want to see how I've been running things." He glanced at it that evening. She caught him looking. "Anything wrong with it?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "No," he said. "It's smart. You're rotating the south pasture 3 weeks earlier than most would. Keeps the grass from getting stripped before winter." He paused. "Your father's system?" "Mine," she said. "My father didn't like change." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. "Good system," he said, and went back to reading. She stood in her own kitchen for a moment, feeling oddly thrown off by a compliment that had cost him nothing and yet had arrived without any apparent motive, which in her experience was so unusual as to be almost suspicious. She made herself stop thinking about it and went to check on the north pasture gate, which had been sticking for 2 weeks and which she had not yet had time to fix. When she came back an hour later, it was fixed. The tools were put away clean. Calder was nowhere to be seen. She stood at the gate and ran her hand along the new hinge, and she didn't know what to do with the feeling that sat in her chest, which was something between gratitude and unease, and something else she couldn't name yet and wasn't going to try. The first real test came 12 days in. A blizzard rolled down from the northern range without the usual 3-day warning, just a bruise-colored sky at noon and temperatures dropping so fast that by 2 in the afternoon the air had teeth. Eliza was in the south pasture when it hit, moving the younger cattle toward the shelter shed, and she was 3/4 done when the wind turned and she couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. She knew this land. She'd grown up on it, walked every acre of it in every kind of weather. That was the only reason she didn't panic. She got the last of the cattle into the shed and was latching the door when she heard the structure groan. Not the usual sound of a building in wind, something deeper, like a complaint about something fundamental. She pushed her lantern into the interior and looked up. The main crossbeam had cracked. Not fully, but enough. One more sustained wind load and the roof section above the eastern stall would come in, and the cattle would be in the open in the worst of it. She did not have the materials to brace it herself. She did not have a second pair of hands. She was formulating the calculation. How many animals she could move, how far, before the weather made it too dangerous. When Calder appeared at the shed door, snow-coated, his breath coming in long, controlled pulls, carrying 2 lengths of cut timber and a rope. "I heard it from the barn," he said. "Saw the light." He didn't ask if she needed help. He just came in and went directly to the beam and looked at it with the same focused attention he gave everything, and then he looked at her. "I can brace it from the east side if you hold tension on this rope from the south post." "I know how to hold tension on a rope," she said. "I know you do." No edge to it. He wasn't being condescending, and they both knew it. He was just confirming they were in agreement. "Ready?" "Ready." They worked for 40 minutes in the cold and the noise of the storm, and the beam held. When they were done, Eliza's arms ached from the rope, and Calder had a cut across his forearm where a splintered edge had caught him, not deep but bleeding in the careless way cold weather cuts bleed. He wrapped it with a strip of cloth from his pocket without commenting on it. "That shed needs a full rebuild in spring," he said, looking at the ceiling. "I know. I've known for 2 seasons." She paused. There have been priorities." He nodded, not judging, just receiving information. "We can do it in sections. Doesn't have to be all at once." He'd said it without thinking, she could tell. Not as a claim, just, naturally. The way you'd say it about something you'd already decided was your concern too. Eliza didn't address it. She told herself she hadn't noticed it. But she had. The blizzard kept them inside for 3 days. This had not been anticipated in any of her preparations for what this arrangement would look like in practice. 2 county inspectors and a shared roof. Yes. Weeks of being snowbound in the same 4-room farmhouse, sharing meals and the creak of the same floors, that had not been in the original calculation. What she discovered was that Calder Voss was almost frustratingly easy to be around. He didn't talk to fill silence. When he had something to say, he said it. And when he didn't, he found something useful to do. Reading, repairing small equipment, checking the weather through the north window with the patient regularity of a man who had made peace with conditions he couldn't change. He asked her questions about the cattle operation, not out of politeness, but because he was genuinely trying to understand how she ran things. And his questions were good questions, specific and considered, the kind that told her he'd already been paying attention for longer than she'd realized. On the second evening, she found him at the kitchen table with her father's old maps spread out, comparing them to the county survey she kept in the desk drawer. She stopped in the doorway. "I'm not going through your papers," he said without looking up. He'd heard her come in. She'd noticed he had that quality, a low alertness that didn't translate into jumpiness. The county copy was on the desk. I pulled the maps to compare the watercourse markings. "Why?" He finally looked up. "The southern boundary on the county map doesn't match your father's original survey on the creek alignment. A few of the curves are different, small, but different." Something went quiet in Eliza's chest that had been loud for weeks. "Are you sure?" "No," he said. "Not yet." He looked back at the maps. "I want to be sure before I say anything else." She sat down across from him. She looked at the maps. She didn't say anything for a moment because the implications were starting to assemble themselves in a way that made her feel cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. "If the watercourse has been altered," she said slowly, "someone might have changed the physical marker and then gotten the county survey updated to match the change." He kept his voice level. "Which would affect the boundary valuation, which would affect the acreage count, which would affect what the board sees when they look at your deed." Eliza pressed her palms flat on the table. "Silas?" Calder didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. "That's not a thing you can do quietly," she said. "Redirecting a watercourse. There'd be stakes, physical stakes in the ground." There would. And nobody in the county surveyor's office would update a map without an inspection. Unless the inspector was Silas's man. The fire in the stove made a sound. Outside, the wind pushed at the house with the comfortable indifference of weather that doesn't care what it interrupts. Eliza looked at the maps. Then she looked at Calder. "In the morning," she said, "I want to go look at the southern pasture." "In the morning," he agreed. Neither of them mentioned that in the morning the storm would still be going. Neither of them mentioned that they'd figure out when the storm stopped. They simply agreed, on the same timeline, without discussion. She didn't notice this until she was lying awake an hour later, staring at the ceiling. Then she noticed it very clearly, and she wasn't sure what to do with the fact that it hadn't felt strange at all. The storm broke on the 4th morning, not gently. Nothing about Montana weather was gentle in November. It simply stopped, the way a held breath finally releases, and left behind a silence so complete that Eliza could hear the cattle moving in the far shed from inside the kitchen. She was already dressed when she heard Calder's boots on the floor of the east wing, already pulling on her coat when he appeared in the doorway with his hat in his hand and the same expression he always wore in the morning, which was to say, no expression in particular, just a kind of settled readiness. "Ground's going to be hard," he said. "Good." She picked up her father's maps, folded the way she'd left them the night before. "Hard ground holds tracks." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded and went to get his coat. They rode out to the southern pasture without much conversation. That had become its own kind of language between them over the past 2 weeks, the absence of talk that wasn't necessary. Eliza had spent most of her adult life around men who filled silence compulsively, as though quiet was an accusation they needed to defend against. Calder didn't do that. It had unsettled her at first, the way anything you're not expecting unsettles you. Now it just felt like the natural weather of being around him. The southern pasture ran along a low ridge before it dropped toward the creek. Her father had always called it the prettiest piece of the property, which for a man who rarely used words like pretty meant something. In summer, the grass came in thick, and the water ran clear through the lower section, and the whole thing had a quality of quiet abundance that made you understand why somebody had wanted to build a life here. In November, it was frozen mud and gray light and dead grass laid flat by 3 days of snow, and it was immediately obvious that something was wrong. Eliza saw it before Calder said anything. She pulled her horse up and sat looking at the southern fence line, where the posts ran down toward the creek bank. There were stakes in the ground. 4 of them, driven at intervals she recognized from county survey work. She'd watched surveyors mark her father's land twice over the years, and she knew what the spacing meant. Someone had come onto her property, within the last month by the look of the wood, and driven survey markers into the southern pasture. She got off her horse. She walked to the nearest stake and crouched down beside it. It was new. The wood was still pale where it had been cut, barely weathered. She looked up at the fence line, then back toward the creek, and she felt something shift in her chest like a key turning in a lock that had been stuck for a while. Calder. He was already beside her. He'd dismounted without her hearing him, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved, quietly, without announcement. "Look at the angle," she said. "Look where they've placed these relative to the water." He looked. He was quiet for a moment, following the line of stakes with his eyes down toward the bank. Then he went further. He walked along the fence line, past the last stake, down toward where the creek should have curved west under the old cottonwood her father had always used as a landmark. The cottonwood was still there. The creek was not where it should have been. It wasn't a dramatic change. That was the thing that made it almost worse. It wasn't dramatic at all. It was the kind of thing you'd miss unless you knew this land the way Eliza knew it, unless you'd walked this exact ground in every season for 20 years and had the original survey in your memory the way you have an old song, without having to think about it. The creek had been redirected. Not much, maybe 15, 18 feet at the bend. But 15 feet on a boundary watercourse was enough. Enough to shift the acreage calculation. Enough to put several acres of her best grazing land on the wrong side of what the county would consider the property line. Eliza stood at the edge of the displaced bank and looked at it for a long time. "How long?" she said. Calder studied the bank, the disturbed earth now frozen solid, the way the water had cut its new path. 3, 4 months. Before first freeze, I'd say. Before my father died. Yes. She stood very still. The cold was specific and mean, the kind that found the gaps at your collar and wrists regardless of how you dressed. She barely felt it. "He knew," she said. "Silas started this before my father was even in the ground." Calder didn't respond to that immediately. He was crouching by the bank now, looking at something in the frozen earth. He scraped at it with his boot heel, and the edge of something dark came free. A piece of broken timber, weathered and deliberately buried just below the surface. "This was the original bank reinforcement," he said. "Someone pulled it up and moved it." Eliza crouched beside him and looked at the timber. Her father had placed bank reinforcements along the southern curve 7 years ago, after a wet spring eroded the edge. She remembered helping him do it. The wood had his particular way of notching it, a habit he'd picked up from his own father, something so specific it was almost a signature. She picked up the piece of timber. She turned it over. There was the notch. "I need you to remember everything you're looking at right now," she said quietly. "Every stake, every measurement, this timber, I need you to be able to describe it." "I know," Calder said. "If it comes to it, Eliza." He said her name the way he said most things, plainly, without weight put in the wrong place. "I know. I've been looking." She put the timber down. She stood up. For a moment she just breathed, not calming herself exactly, but organizing herself, the way you triage what needs doing when 3 things break at once. "We need the original surveyor," she said. "My father used a man named Aldous Pruitt. He's old now. I don't know if he's still practicing, but he did every survey on this property going back to the original deed. He'd know." "Where is he?" 12 miles. Retired, I think. Keeps a place near the Harkin Road." Calder nodded once. He looked at the stakes again, then at the sky. Measuring daylight, she understood, calculating what could still be done before dark. "I can ride out tomorrow if the road's passable. Tonight I want to measure the stakes and write down the positions. Do you have drafting paper?" She looked at him. "You can draft survey measurements?" I can make a readable record. A pause. My father surveyed irrigation rights in the valley for 12 years. I used to help him when I was young. Another pause, shorter. Not a skill I've mentioned before. No, she said. You haven't. She thought about that for a second, about all the things a person carried quietly without listing them out. There's drafting paper in the desk, bottom drawer. They rode back in the same quiet they'd ridden out in, but it was a different kind of quiet now, charged in a way the morning hadn't been. Eliza was thinking hard, and she suspected Calder was too, and there was something almost strange about how naturally they'd begun to operate as a two-person unit without discussing it, without any kind of formal renegotiation of what this arrangement was supposed to include. She thought about that, riding back through the frozen pasture. Then she stopped thinking about it, because she needed to think about Silas Crowder, and she couldn't do both at once. Silas Crowder was 61 years old, and had spent the last 30 of those years accumulating land, influence, water rights, and the particular kind of credibility that comes in a small community when you've been the biggest man in it long enough that people have simply stopped imagining it any other way. He wasn't universally liked. Eliza had never heard anyone call him a friend the way you'd mean it. But he was respected in the transactional sense, which in a place like Raven Creek was often more useful than being liked. What made him genuinely dangerous wasn't his money or his connections to the county board, though both of those were real. What made him dangerous was that he was patient. He didn't get angry and act. He planned and waited. He'd been watching her father's health decline for 2 years, and instead of approaching while her father was alive and might have fought back, he'd simply waited until the man was gone and then moved within 72 hours. That kind of patience required either no conscience or a conscience so thoroughly buried it couldn't make noise anymore. Eliza didn't know which kind he was. She didn't particularly need to know. She just needed to be more prepared than he expected her to be. The problem was that she didn't know the full shape of what he was planning. She knew about the restriction filing, and now she knew about the survey manipulation. But Silas hadn't built what he'd built by being a one-move man. There was more. She was sure of it. She just didn't know what she didn't know yet, and that was the part that kept her awake. Aldous Pruitt was 82 years old, almost completely deaf in one ear, and possessed of the particular mental sharpness that sometimes comes with great age, the kind where the person has shed everything unimportant and kept only what actually mattered, refined by decades into something almost uncomfortably clear. He received Calder in his front room the next morning, surrounded by boxes of survey records that he could apparently locate anything within by memory, which he demonstrated by finding Eliza's father's original property survey in under 2 minutes without looking at a single label. He spread it on his kitchen table, put on a pair of thick-lensed spectacles, and looked at the measurements Calder had drafted the evening before. Then he was quiet for a long time. "Someone moved the creek," he said. "Yes," Calder said. "This is the Marlowe property. Thomas Marlowe's girl has it now." "She does. I'm her husband." Pruitt looked up at him over the spectacles. His expression was not suspicious, exactly, more assessing. The look of a man who'd spent a lifetime measuring things and had gotten reasonably good at measuring people too. "I heard about that," Pruitt said. "Quick arrangement." "Practical arrangement," Calder said. Pruitt looked back at the papers. The creek was surveyed in 1891, resurveyed in 1904 after the spring flood. I did both. The eastern curve of the south boundary ran along the cottonwood on a bearing of 267 degrees magnetic. He tapped Calder's draft. "What you've described here is closer to 253. That's a 14-degree deviation, which moves the boundary, which moves it 18 to 20 feet at the point of maximum displacement. On that section, Pruitt found something on the original survey, pointed at it. That's approximately 4.5 acres of the south grazing land that would fall outside the marked boundary. Who would have access to redirect a watercourse at that scale?" Pruitt took off his spectacles and looked at Calder. "Someone with equipment, someone with men. Someone who could do it quietly over several weeks and had enough standing that nobody who saw it would ask questions." He paused. "Or if they did ask, wouldn't push for answers." Calder looked at him steadily. "Would you testify to what you've told me, if it came to that?" Pruitt was quiet for a moment. He looked out his window at the flat winter landscape, and something moved in his face. Some old calculation, something that had to do with how much of his remaining time he was willing to spend on the right side of something versus the quiet side. "I'm 82 years old," he said. My wife's been gone 14 years and my son lives in Oregon. My main concern at this point is leaving things right. He put his spectacles back on and picked up Calder's draft. I'll need to go to the site myself, he said. I can't testify to measurements I haven't taken personally. That's always been my rule. When can you make the trip? Day after tomorrow, if the road's what you say it is. He looked at Calder. And you bring that girl of yours. I want to talk to her directly. I knew her father for 40 years. The least I can do is look her in the eye when I tell her what someone's done to his land. Calder rode back in the afternoon and told Eliza what Prewitt had said. They were in the kitchen, she making a poor attempt at biscuits. She was a competent cook in the way someone becomes competent at something they do because it needs doing, rather than because they have any particular gift for it. And he was at the table with a cup of coffee, and she listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He'll testify, she said. It wasn't a question. He'll testify. She nodded. She put the biscuit pan in the oven and stood with her back to him for a moment, her hands resting on the edge of the stove. Calder. Yeah. This is more than you signed up for. She turned around. I want to say that plainly. When you agreed to this arrangement, it was supposed to be quiet. Stay at the property, be visible for inspectors, let the clock run out. This has become something else, and I don't think you should feel... Eliza. His voice was not sharp, but it stopped her. He set his coffee down. I know what I signed up for. I'm not sure you did, because I didn't know what I was signing up for either. None of that changes what needs doing right now. She looked at him. There was something in his stillness that she'd been trying to categorize for weeks and hadn't managed. It wasn't passivity. She'd spent enough time around passive men to know the difference. It was more like the quality of a deep well, where the surface was calm because there was a great deal of depth below it, rather than because there was nothing there. All right, she said finally. Day after tomorrow, then. Day after tomorrow. She turned back to the stove. A minute passed. The biscuits are going to be bad, she said. I'm telling you now so you're not surprised. There was a short pause. I've had bad biscuits before. Not like these. Another pause, shorter. Probably true. She heard him pick up his coffee again, and she felt something that was halfway between laughter and a kind of sadness she couldn't fully account for, and she made herself focus on the stove. The inspectors came on a Thursday. Eliza had known they were coming. There was a formal notice delivered by the county clerk, which Harlan had forwarded with a brief note that said simply, "This is routine, but be prepared." The notice was signed by 3 members of the county board, and 2 of the 3 names on it were men she knew had done business with Silas Crowder. So, routine in form, not routine in intent. There were 2 of them, a younger man named Garrett, who kept looking at his paperwork rather than at her, and an older one named Cole, who had the blunt, weathered face of someone who'd been doing government work long enough to have stopped pretending he enjoyed it. They walked through the house, looked at the shared bedroom, which Eliza had prepared with a kind of grim practicality, 2 sets of boots by the door, 2 coats on the hook, 2 coffee cups on the morning shelf that she had placed with the specific self-consciousness of someone staging a scene. And then they walked the property. Calder was there for all of it. He was, she had to admit this to herself, exactly right. Not performative, not trying too hard, not overclaiming in any direction. When Cole asked him about the cattle rotation, Calder described it accurately, which he could do because he'd actually been doing it. When Garrett asked how long Calder had been running horses on the property, Calder said that he'd brought the first 4 over 3 weeks ago and was planning to bring the rest in spring, which was true. When Cole, and this was the one she'd been watching for, asked Calder to show him where the irrigation feeds from the creek entered the southern pasture, Calder walked him directly to the spot without hesitation. Without hesitation. Because he'd been there. Because he actually knew. She watched Cole's face when Calder answered that last question, and she saw something settle in the older man's expression. Not warmth exactly, but a certain letdown of suspicion. The look of someone who had come prepared to catch something and has not caught it. When they left, Cole paused at the gate and looked back at the ranch with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Mrs. Voss, he said. She was still adjusting to the name. It felt like wearing someone else's coat. The board will want a follow-up inspection in 60 days. That's their right, she said. They're welcome. Cole looked at her for a moment. You're Thomas Marlowe's daughter. I am. Good man. He said it the way people say things about the dead when they mean it, briefly, without elaboration. He put his hat on and left. Eliza stood at the gate until they were out of sight. Then she let out a breath that she'd been holding for so long it had forgotten it was being held. Calder came up beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't point out that it had gone well, or offer reassurance, or do any of the things that would have made the moment smaller than it was. After a minute, she said, "They'll report to the board that the household looks legitimate." "Yes." "Which means the board can't cite the restriction, which means Silas can't use the restriction angle anymore." "For now." She looked at him sideways. "You think there's another angle?" "There's always another angle when the first one doesn't work." He was looking down the road the inspectors had taken. He didn't file that restriction and manipulate that survey and wait 2 years for this to fall apart after one inspection. He has something else. She was quiet. This matched her own thinking so precisely that for a moment she had the disorienting feeling of hearing her own thoughts spoken back to her in someone else's voice. "Then we need to be ready before he uses it," she said. "What does that look like?" "It looks like us knowing more than we currently know." She turned back toward the house. "I need to talk to some people in town, quietly." "Which people?" She thought about it. "The women," she said. "The ranching wives. They know things their husbands don't talk about at the feed store." Calder looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprised, more like a reassessment, quick and quiet. "That's smart," he said. "Yes," she agreed, without false modesty. "It is." The next 2 weeks were a study in patience that Eliza found almost physically painful. She was, at her core, a person who preferred problems she could get her hands around. A broken fence, a sick calf, an account that didn't balance. The kind of threat Silas represented was harder. It lived in conversation and implication and legal maneuver, in things said around the edges of other things, and it required a kind of waiting that sat badly with her. But she waited, and she listened. Margaret Hale, whose husband Owen ran cattle on the western edge of the valley, invited Eliza to a sewing circle that she had in fact been invited to several times before and declined. She went this time. She sat with 6 women in Margaret's parlor and drank bad tea, and did adequate sewing and listened to an hour of conversation about weather and cattle prices, and whose daughter was marrying whom before the conversation, the way conversations in small communities inevitably do, turned to the thing that everyone was actually thinking about. "Crowder's been talking," said a woman named Ruth, who was 75 and gave no indication of caring what anyone thought of what she said. "At the land board meeting last week, my husband was there. Crowder said he had evidence the Marlowe-Voss marriage was arranged purely to circumvent the restriction." "What evidence?" said Margaret carefully. "He didn't say. Just that he had it." Ruth looked at Eliza over her sewing. "Said the man, your husband, maintains his real residence at his homestead north of the ridge, that the household up at your place is staged." "My husband's horses are in my barn," Eliza said, keeping her voice conversational. "His tools are in my equipment shed. His name is on the Water Authority registration we filed last month." A pause. "What would you say that suggests?" Ruth studied her. There was something in the old woman's eyes that was almost amused. "I'd say it suggests someone's done their paperwork." "We have." "Crowder's also been telling the Delaney brothers," said a younger woman named Frances, "that your property deed is going to be under contest before spring. He's been saying it like it's decided, like he already knows." Eliza kept her face neutral. "Crowder says a lot of things." "He does," Frances said. "But the Delaney brothers have already stopped letting their cattle graze the shared south fence line with your property, like they're preparing for the boundary to move." Eliza went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table and wrote down everything she'd heard in a neat, organized list. Then she read it back to herself and understood, with the cold clarity that sometimes comes when scattered information suddenly arranges itself, that Silas wasn't just planning a second attack. He was already in the middle of it. The move she hadn't anticipated wasn't legal, not directly. It was reputational. He was telling people the outcome before it happened, shaping the community's expectations so that when he made his next filing, it wouldn't feel like aggression. It would feel like confirmation of something everyone had already been told to expect. By the time he made his formal move, the ground would already be prepared. She heard Calder come in from the barn and waited until he'd poured himself a coffee and come to the table. Then she pushed the list toward him without preamble. He read it. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but she'd learned to read his stillness, the slight tightening around the eyes that meant he was angry, the way his thumb moved once against the edge of the paper, which meant he was thinking hard. He's going to claim fraud, Calder said. Not just the residency thing. He's going to claim the entire marriage was a fraudulent arrangement designed to circumvent a legitimate legal restriction, and he's going to bring witnesses who'll say they knew it from the start. Who? People who owe him, and anyone who heard us when we signed, because we were not exactly discreet about the nature of the arrangement at the time. Eliza closed her eyes briefly. He was right. They hadn't been discreet. They'd been so focused on moving quickly that they hadn't been careful about who might have been listening when she'd walked into that blacksmith shop and said, flat out, "I need a husband before Saturday." "How many people do you think heard that?" she asked. "In Raven Creek?" He picked up his coffee. "Enough." She stared at the table. "So what do we do?" Calder was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the particular quality it got when he was saying something he'd already thought through completely and was now simply delivering. "We make it harder for him to call it fraud." "How?" "We stop operating like people who have an arrangement." He paused. "We operate like people who have a marriage." She looked at him. "We are operating No." He was direct without being harsh. "We're operating like two people who have an efficient working partnership and share a house, which is exactly what we have and exactly what Silas's witnesses will describe." He set his coffee down. "The cattle herds. We should combine them, file the consolidation with the land authority, move my remaining horses onto this property, close my northern homestead officially, not just leave it unused, actually file the closure, make this the household of record, undeniably, in every register." She understood what he was proposing. She also understood what it would cost him. "If this falls apart, it won't." "If it does," she said more firmly, "you lose your homestead, you lose your fallback. Calder, that land is the only thing you own free and clear." He looked at her steadily. "I know. That was never part of this." "I know that too." "Then why?" "Because it stopped being an arrangement for me a long time ago." The words landed in the kitchen the way certain words do, without drama, without the weight of someone trying to make an impact, which somehow made them heavier than if he'd been trying. He didn't elaborate. He didn't look away. He just sat there, honest, the way he was honest about everything, with the unsettling directness of a man who'd decided at some point that pretending required more energy than he had to spare. Eliza opened her mouth. She didn't know what she was going to say. She hadn't sorted through what she felt about what he'd just said, and she needed time that she didn't currently have because outside, through the north window, she could see lantern light moving along the ridge road. Multiple lanterns, moving together. Calder saw at the same moment she did. He was on his feet before she said anything. He went to the window and looked out, and his jaw tightened in the way that had replaced the thumb movement on paper as her indicator that something was seriously wrong. "How many do you count?" she said, coming to stand beside him. 7, 8. A pause. "Some of them are deputized." She looked at the lights moving steadily down the ridge toward the ranch gate. Lanterns on horseback, in formation, in the cold dead of a Montana night. "He's not waiting for the board meeting," she said. "No," Calder said. "He's not." She looked at the lights. She looked at her father's maps still on the table. She looked at the list she'd made from what the women had told her, and at the coffee cups that were still sitting side by side on the morning shelf, the way they had been since the inspectors came, and at the coat that was Calder's hanging next to the coat that was hers on the hook by the door. Something settled in her then. Not calm, exactly. More like the specific quality of focus that arrives when there's no longer any question about what you're going to do because you've run out of alternatives and landed on the truth. "Open the lamp in the front window," she said. Calder looked at her. "I want them to see we're awake," she said. "I want every neighbor on this road who sees lanterns coming down toward the Marlowe place to know that we knew they were coming and were still standing at the window." He crossed the kitchen and lit the front lamp without another word. And outside, the riders kept coming. There were 8 of them. Eliza counted as they came through the dark. 8 riders, 2 of them wearing the deputy badges that caught the lamplight when they moved. The rest hired men she recognized from Crowder's outfit. Leading them, on a gray horse that cost more than most families in Raven Creek made in a year, was Silas Crowder himself. He was not a large man physically. That was the thing people who hadn't met him sometimes got wrong. They expected someone who looked like what he was, a man who'd spent 30 years consuming everything within reach. And what they got instead was someone trim and gray-haired with a careful posture and the kind of face that had learned somewhere along the way to reveal nothing it didn't intend to reveal. He wore good clothes even in the middle of the night, riding out to a confrontation he'd manufactured himself. That told you everything you needed to know about how he thought of this. He thought of this as a formality. Eliza pulled on her coat. Calder was already at the door. "Let me go first," she said. He looked at her. "Eliza, it's my land they're coming for." She held his gaze. "Let me go first." A beat. Then he stepped back from the door. She walked out onto the porch alone, into the cold and the dark, and she stood with her hands at her sides and waited while Silas Crowder rode to the edge of her gate and stopped. Behind her, she heard the door. Calder had come out anyway, which she'd expected, and she found she didn't mind. He stood behind her and to her left, just far enough back that nobody could accuse him of crowding the moment, but close enough that his presence was unambiguous. Silas looked at her the way he always looked at her, with the particular expression of a man who is accustomed to problems resolving themselves when he arrives. He looked at Calder briefly, then back at her. "Miss Marlowe," he said. "Mrs. Voss," she said. Something moved in his jaw. It wasn't anger, more like the minor irritation of finding a word misspelled in your own letter. "I have an emergency order from the county board," he said, authorizing a temporary seizure of this property pending review of the deed status. "At 9 o'clock at night," she said. "The order has no restriction on hours." "No," she agreed. "I don't suppose it does. May I see it?" He nodded to one of the deputies, who rode forward and held out a folded document. Eliza walked down the porch steps and took it. She opened it. She read it carefully, which took longer than Silas expected. She could tell by the small shift in his horse's stance, which mirrored the rider. He'd expected her to look at it and be overwhelmed. She wasn't going to be overwhelmed. She was terrified, but that was entirely different from overwhelmed, and she'd learned the distance between those two things a long time ago. The order was real. That was the first thing she confirmed. Not forged, not improperly stamped, legitimately issued by the county board, 2 signatures and a seal. The second thing she confirmed was the basis cited, alleged fraudulent establishment of qualifying household partnership for the purpose of circumventing territorial property restriction 14b. Alleged fraudulent. Those 2 words had been chosen carefully. Alleged meant it wasn't proven yet. Fraudulent meant Silas had convinced the board to act on accusation before evidence. The third thing she confirmed, looking at the date on the document, was that this order had been filed 4 days ago. 4 days ago, Silas had already known what he was going to do. He'd let the inspectors come. He'd let them report back. And then he'd filed this anyway, either because the inspector's report hadn't been favorable to his case, which meant he didn't care about the report, or because he'd arranged for the report to be favorable to him, regardless of what the inspectors had actually seen. She thought about the way Cole had looked at her when he left. She thought, I don't know which side he's on. She folded the document and held it back out to the deputy without looking at him. This order authorizes review of the deed status, she said to Silas. It does not authorize seizure of a functioning cattle operation, removal of livestock, or interference with ongoing property management. Those would require a separate order. She paused. Do you have a separate order? Silas looked at her steadily. The temporary seizure is of the deed status, not the physical property. She'd gone over this with Harlan 2 days ago, in a conversation she'd initiated specifically because she'd suspected something like this was coming. You can dispute my title. You cannot put your men on this land or move my cattle or enter my structures until a court affirms the seizure. Not a board, a court. That's in the Territorial Code, Chapter 9, Section 41. She kept her voice completely even. Mr. Harlan was kind enough to write it out for me. I have the citation in the house if you'd like to see it. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man reconsidering. It was the silence of a man recalibrating, filing away that she'd been more prepared than he'd accounted for, and adjusting accordingly. She watched his face do it and felt a cold, clear hatred of him that she'd been carrying for weeks but had not allowed herself to fully feel until this moment. You've been busy, he said. I've been doing my job, she said, which is managing this property. which I intend to keep doing. Silas looked past her at Calder. He studied him with the dispassionate attention of someone pricing livestock. Voss, he said, you're a horseman. You've got a homestead north of the ridge that you've had for what, 8, 9 years? You've got horses up there right now. I've got some gear up there, Calder said. His voice was easy, which Eliza knew by now meant he was being careful. The horses are here. Gear. Silas seemed to find this mildly amusing. Man leaves gear at a property he's abandoned. Man leaves his horses at the property he's living at. That seems like a meaningful distinction to you? Seems like an accurate one, Calder said. I have witnesses, Silas said, still easy, still with that flat, patient quality of a man who is holding something back because he knows he doesn't need it yet, who will testify before the board that you, specifically, stated to multiple individuals in Raven Creek that this marriage was a legal arrangement with a defined endpoint, a business agreement. He let that sit for a moment. People heard you say it, Voss, in the blacksmith shop. And she... His eyes moved to Eliza. She walked into that shop and said it in front of whoever was there to hear it. I need a husband before Saturday. Those were the words, as I understand it. Eliza felt the ground shift slightly under the conversation. She kept her face still. People get married in a hurry all the time, she said. The words people use when they're scared and in a hurry are not always the most precise. But they're revealing, Silas said. Don't you think? Neither she nor Calder answered that. Silas seemed to take a kind of satisfaction in the silence, though he didn't show it in any way she could point to afterward. It was more a quality in the air around him, a settling, like something clicking into a position he'd been moving it toward. The board will determine, he said, whether this arrangement satisfies the restriction or whether it constitutes fraud. If it's fraud, the deed reverts to contested status and the auction proceeds. He gathered his reins. I'd recommend you consider whether fighting this is in your financial interest, Miss Marlowe. Litigation is expensive. You don't have the resources I have, and we both know it. He said it without cruelty. He said it the way he said everything, as though it were simply information, facts, the terrain as it existed, regardless of feelings. He turned his horse and rode back up the ridge road, and his men followed him, and the lanterns went with them, and Eliza and Calder stood on the porch in the dark until the last light disappeared. Then she went back inside. She sat down at the table. She pressed her hands flat on the wood and stared at them for a moment. He's right about the money, she said. I know. A board challenge, if he takes it all the way to a formal dispute hearing, could run 6 months. The legal fees alone. I know, Calder said again. He sat down across from her. We don't fight him the way he's fighting us. She looked up. He's trying to win on paper, Calder said. Documents, witnesses, board filings. He's built his whole life doing this, taking things from people through the machinery of it, slow and legal and expensive, until they just don't have anything left to fight with. He paused. We can't out-resource him on that ground, so we don't fight on that ground. Then what ground? His. He met her eyes. He's been telling people in this town that the outcome is decided, that your land is already effectively his. He's been doing it so that when the formal move comes, it doesn't look like an attack. It looks like a conclusion. A pause. So we make the whole thing public before he can control the story. We put everything we know. The survey stakes, the redirected creek, Prewitt's testimony, the map comparisons, in front of the entire community, not the board, the people. A public accounting, Eliza said slowly. He's been operating in the back rooms because that's where he's strongest. The board meetings, the private conversations, the things said around the edges of things. Calder's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a quiet anger she didn't often hear from him, and which, when it surfaced, was somehow more serious precisely because it was usually so absent. He counted on you not having any place to put what you know. Somewhere he can't control the room. Eliza was quiet for a long moment. The fire in the stove made small sounds. Outside, the wind had died down after the riders left, and the night was very still. It's a risk, she said. If we do this publicly and the community doesn't believe us, they will. You don't know that. No, he said, I don't. But I know that Silas Crowder has been the biggest man in this valley for 30 years, and the people who resent that don't say so because they can't afford to. Put what he's done in the open. He stopped. People have been waiting for someone to open that door. She thought about what Ruth had said at the sewing circle said with that particular tone of a woman who has been watching something happen for years and filing it away in the place you file things that you know and can't use. She thought about Margaret Hale's face when Silas's name came up, the careful neutrality of it, the specific kind of careful that comes from practice. "We need the ranchers," she said, "the ones who border my land, the ones Silas has been building relationships with, or acquiring, depending on how you look at it. We need them to understand that what he's doing to you, he can do to them. Or has already done to some of them." Calder looked at her. "Have you heard something?" "Nothing specific, but—" She stopped, thinking about how to say this. Silas doesn't change methods. He finds something that works, and he repeats it. The survey manipulation, the boundary adjustment, that's a technique, and techniques get used more than once. We need to know who else he's done it to. Yes. That's not a short conversation, Calder said, and it needs to happen before he makes his next filing. He's going to move again, probably in the next week, maybe less. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it first. Eliza looked at him across the table. The lamp between them threw a warm, unreliable light that made the kitchen feel smaller than it was. And she had a sudden and very specific awareness of how many hours she'd spent at this table with him over the past weeks, in the particular comfort of someone else's steady presence. She'd grown up learning to be enough on her own. She'd been enough on her own, but there was a difference, she was understanding now, between being enough and being whole. She pushed that thought to the edge where she kept things she wasn't ready to examine. "All right," she said, "we start tomorrow." They split the work in the way they'd been splitting everything, without long discussion, by some mutual understanding of who knew who and who was trusted where. Calder rode north and west to the 3 ranching families who shared boundary lines with properties adjacent to Crowder's holdings. Eliza went south and east to the families who had been closest to her father and who would, she believed, give her an honest conversation if she asked directly. What she found was more than she'd expected, and worse. The Harkin family, father and 2 sons who ran beef cattle on the eastern slope, had experienced a water rights dispute 18 months ago that had ended with them signing over a secondary creek access to Crowder land and cattle. Walter Harkin, who was 69 and had the specific exhaustion of a man who'd fought something and lost, told her the story at his kitchen table while his wife made coffee and did not look at either of them. "He had a survey done," Walter said the creek access we'd been using crossed a corner of his property. We knew it wasn't true. We'd been using that access for 20 years, but he had a county surveyor, a man named Beauchamp, works out of the East County office, who signed a document saying Crowder's version was correct. "Beauchamp," Eliza said. "You know him?" "I know the name." She kept her voice neutral. She was thinking about the county survey map that didn't match her father's original, and who would have had to sign off on an update. "What happened after he showed you the survey?" "We hired a lawyer. Ran 3 months, cost us more than we had to spend." Walter put his cup down. "In the end, we signed the access over. We couldn't keep paying." He looked at his hands. "My grandfather built that water access. My father used it. My boys needed it." He stopped. "You can't fight a man who can afford to run the clock on you indefinitely." Eliza thanked him. She rode to 2 other properties and had variations of the same conversation. Not identical. Silas was too careful to repeat himself exactly. But the shape was the same. Survey document. County surveyor named Beauchamp. Financial pressure applied through legal process until the target gave up. One family had lost access to a shared grazing route. Another had signed over mineral rights on their north section for a payment that, now that they knew what those rights were worth, made the older son visibly angry in the way of someone who has been cheated and can prove it, but still can't undo it. She rode home in the late afternoon with the light going orange and thin on the ridge, and she felt something that wasn't triumph. It was heavier than that, muddier, because these were people who'd been hurt, and she was going to have to ask them to let that hurt be used. She didn't know yet if they'd let her. Calder got back an hour after she did. He poured 2 cups of coffee, sat down, and looked at her in the way he had when he knew she'd found something and was waiting for her to tell it, rather than asking. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "Beauchamp's the thread," he said. "Yes." "If the same surveyor produced fraudulent documents in multiple cases for the same client, it's not an error," Eliza said. "It's a practice. and Prewitt can identify the survey work on your property as inconsistent with standard practice, which points to manipulation, which connects to Beauchamp, which connects to Silas. Calder picked up his coffee. He's been running this operation for years, probably longer than we know. Eliza nodded. She was thinking about her father, about the last year of his life when he'd been sick and preoccupied and less attentive to the business than he'd always been. Whether Silas had made any moves during that period that her father had noticed or missed, whether there were papers she hadn't looked at carefully enough yet. "I need to go through my father's records," she said. "All of them. Not just the property documents, the correspondence, the account books, everything. If Silas tried anything while my father was sick, there might be a trace." "How long will that take?" "Days, maybe longer." She looked at the shelf above the desk where her father's files were stacked in the specific disorder of a man who always knew exactly where everything was and saw no reason to organize it for anyone else's benefit. "But not before we go to Prewitt. I want his assessment of the survey stakes on record before anything else happens." "Tomorrow morning?" "Tomorrow morning." She did not sleep well. She lay awake in the East Wing room that had become, over these weeks, less strange to her than she expected, and she thought about what Silas had said on the porch. "Litigation is expensive, you don't have the resources I have." And she thought about how precisely true that was. She had enough to maintain the operation through spring if nothing went wrong. She did not have enough to run a 6-month legal battle against a man with Crowder's resources, which meant they had to end this before it became that. She was still working through the calculation when she heard, from the east side of the house, the particular sound of someone who also wasn't sleeping, a creak of floorboards, then quiet. She lay still and listened and didn't hear anything else. She told herself it meant nothing. People weren't always sleeping when they were quiet. She thought about what he'd said at the table. "It stopped being an arrangement for me a long time ago." She thought about the way he'd said it, without build-up, without the careful framing people use when they're saying something they want credit for saying. He'd said it like he was simply correcting the record. She didn't know what to do with it. She'd spent her adult life being practical, and what he'd said was not a practical thing and could not be responded to practically, and she was so constitutionally unsuited to dealing with anything. She couldn't sort into a category and address directly that she had been more or less pretending it hadn't been said ever since. She was still pretending it hadn't been said when she fell asleep, sometime around the 2nd hour of the night. Prewitt came to the property 2 days later. Eliza had been worried about the old man making the ride in the winter cold, but he arrived on a solid-looking bay horse with the unbothered air of someone who'd been riding 12 miles in bad weather for 6 decades and saw no reason to start calling it difficult. He tied up at the gate, shook Eliza's hand with a grip that surprised her, and said, "Show me the stakes." They spent 3 hours in the southern pasture. Prewitt moved slowly but with total precision, measuring, noting, comparing to his original survey records, which he'd brought in a canvas bag strapped to his saddle. He didn't talk much while he worked. He made sounds, small, non-committal sounds that Eliza couldn't read as good or bad. And he wrote in a notebook with a pencil he sharpened twice over the course of the morning. Calder walked with him without interjecting. Eliza did the same. She'd learned from watching Calder that sometimes the most useful thing you could do was stay out of the way of someone doing something they knew better than you. At the end of the 3 hours, Prewitt stood at the edge of the displaced creek bank and looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned to Eliza. "Someone excavated and repositioned the eastern bank of this watercourse," he said. "The displacement is consistent with mechanical equipment. This wasn't done by hand. Somebody brought machinery onto this property, or brought it to the creek boundary from the adjacent property, and moved an 18-foot section of bank. Then they stabilized the new position with packed fill and let the water establish a new channel." He paused. "The time frame is consistent with late summer, early fall, before your father died." "Can you say that with certainty?" Eliza asked. "I can say it's consistent with the evidence." Prewitt looked at his notebook. "And I can say that the survey stake positions I've measured today do not reflect the watercourse boundary as established in my original survey of this property, which is a matter of record in the county office." He looked at her. "If someone filed an updated survey with the county showing this creek position, that survey is wrong. Whether it was wrong because someone made an error or because someone falsified the measurements is a question for the board to determine." "The surveyor's name is Beauchamp," Eliza said. "Do you know him?" Something shifted in Prewitt's face. Not surprise. More like recognition. I know the name. Has he done work like this before? Prewitt looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I've seen 2 other surveys in this county in the past 5 years that I had questions about. Both involved boundary watercourses. Both were signed by Beauchamp. The cold air sat between them. Would you be willing to include that in your testimony? Eliza said. Prewitt was quiet for a moment. He looked out across the pasture, across the land that had been her father's and her grandfather's before that, and which someone had been quietly, methodically carving away from the edges while the Marlowes weren't watching. Yes, he said. I will. They rode back to the house, and Eliza made coffee, and Prewitt sat at the kitchen table and wrote out a formal statement in the careful hand of a man who'd been writing legal documents for 60 years. Calder witnessed it. Eliza kept her face neutral through the whole thing, which cost her more than she let anyone see. When Prewitt left, she stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride up the road, and she breathed very carefully, in and out, because the thing she'd been holding at a distance was now in the room with her, and she had to decide what to do with it. The anger. Not the sharp, manageable anger of finding out what Silas had done. She'd had that for weeks. This was different. This was the deeper kind, the kind that had to do with her father, with the fact that this had started before he died, possibly while he was sick and didn't know what was being done to the edges of his land. That Silas Crowder had looked at a dying man and seen an opportunity and started moving machinery. Eliza, Calder said. She didn't turn around. I'm fine. You're not, and that's not a problem. He said it the way he said everything important, without fuss, without maneuvering. You don't have to be fine right now. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window. Outside, Prewitt's horse was already small in the distance. He started this while my father was alive, she said. He was already moving stakes while my father was still in this house. She stopped. My father worked that land for 40 years. He built it from 60 acres. He didn't... She stopped again, breathed. He deserved better than to have it stripped from him piece by piece while he was too sick to see it happening. Calder didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. You're going to make sure he knows what was done to it. She turned from the window. He's gone, Calder. He can't know. No. He met her eyes. But you can keep it, and how you keep it is going to say something about who he was and who you are. He paused. Silas gets to write the end of this story, or you do. That's what this is. She stood there looking at him, and she felt the anger resolve into something harder and cleaner, the way a river running chaotically over rocks finally finds a channel and moves with direction. Then let's go through my father's records, she said. Tonight, all of them. It took 4 days. They did it at the kitchen table after evening, when the day's work was done, and there was always a day's work, cattle and horses and fences, and the 1,000 small demands of a working property that did not pause for personal crises. They'd come in from the cold and make something to eat, and then spread her father's papers across the table and work through them by lamplight. It was, in its way, the strangest 4 days of Eliza's life. Going through her father's records was like listening to him talk. His handwriting, his notations in the margins, the particular shorthand he'd developed over decades that she understood without thinking because she'd grown up watching him write it. She found records of conversations, property negotiations, grazing agreements going back to before she was born. She found a letter from the county water authority that her father had filed away in a box of paid invoices, possibly by accident, that described a preliminary inquiry into the boundary of the southern watercourse, dated 14 months before he died. She read it twice. He knew something was wrong, she said. Calder looked up from the account books. 14 months ago. He inquired with the water authority about the boundary. He must have noticed something. The water level, the bank erosion pattern, something. She set the letter down carefully. He knew something was off, and he never told me. Maybe he didn't want to worry you. Maybe he thought he could handle it himself. She felt something twist in her chest. He always thought he could handle things himself. It drove me... She stopped. We were alike in that. Calder looked at her. Maybe, but he also raised a daughter who went looking. He said it simply, without flourish. He knew what he was doing. Eliza held the letter for another moment. Then she set it with the growing stack of documents that were forming, piece by piece, into something that might actually be enough. It was on the fourth night that she found the notation in the account book from 18 months ago. A payment, recorded in her father's hand for a service she couldn't immediately identify from the description. Boundary consultation, southern section, paid in full. The amount was small. The name of who had been paid was Beauchamp. Her father had hired Beauchamp 18 months ago for a boundary consultation. She sat very still with the account book in her hands. Calder noticed. He came around the table and looked at what she was holding. She watched his face as he read it and saw him arrive at the same understanding. He hired Beauchamp, she said. My father hired him for a consultation, and then Beauchamp took everything he learned about this property's boundary conditions directly to Crowder. The fire in the stove. The lamp burning low. The 4 days of her father's records spread across the table like a life taken apart and laid out for counting. He sold us out, Eliza said. Not loudly, almost quietly. My father trusted him with the boundary details, and Beauchamp sold that information to Silas, and Silas used it to know exactly where to move the stakes. Which means Silas knew precisely where the manipulation would be hardest to detect, Calder said. He had an inside map. They sat with that for a long moment. We have everything now, Eliza said finally. The original survey, Prewitt's testimony, the displaced stakes, the creek documentation, name appearing in multiple fraudulent surveys across the county, and my father's account record showing Beauchamp was paid for a boundary consultation on this exact section. She looked at Calder. It's enough. It's enough if the right people see it. Then we make sure the right people see it. She set the account book down. Her voice was very steady. We open the gate. We invite everyone. Calder looked at her. Silas has been maneuvering in private because that's where he's strongest, she said. So we pull it into the open. The neighboring ranchers, the townspeople, the county officials, all of them, on this property. And we put every piece of what we know in front of all of them at the same time. He'll fight it. Let him fight it in front of 100 people who've been living next door to his methods for 30 years. Her jaw set. People look different when you take away the private room. Calder studied her for a moment. Then he said, When? Saturday, she said. We need 4 days to reach people and get them here. Saturday. He nodded once. And Calder. She met his eyes. What you said. About your homestead. About combining the herds. If you're still willing, I said it, he said. I meant it. She held his gaze for a moment longer than she meant to, long enough that she had to make a deliberate decision to look away. Then let's get it done, she said, before he files again. She didn't say the rest of it. She kept it in the place. She kept things that weren't ready yet. The things she'd recognized, somewhere between the frozen biscuits and the cattle shed and the lamp burning in the front window while riders came down the dark ridge road, that had nothing to do with property lines or county boards or any of the things she'd told herself this was about. She would have to deal with that eventually, but first they had to survive Saturday. The 4 days before Saturday were the longest of Eliza's life, and she had lived through some long ones. She and Calder split the riding between them, Calder going north and west to reach the ranching families he'd already spoken with, Eliza going south and east to the people who had known her father longest. They were not sending formal invitations. You didn't send formal invitations to something like this. What you did was ride to someone's property and ask for 10 minutes of their time and tell them, plainly, what you'd found and what you intended to do about it, and then you watched their face and you made a judgment about whether they'd come. Most of the faces told her yes before the mouth did. That was the thing she hadn't fully anticipated. How many people in this valley had been carrying something about Silas Crowder that they'd never had occasion to put down? Walter Harkin said yes without hesitation, and his older son, who'd been silent during Eliza's first visit, looked up from the fence he was mending and said he'd bring 2 of his neighbors along if that was all right. The widow Carver, whose husband had died 2 years ago and who was running their property alone in much the way Eliza had been trying to run hers, said yes, and then sat quietly for a moment and said, I wondered when someone was going to do something. Frances from the sewing circle spread the word through channels Eliza didn't have access to. The women's network that moved information through this valley faster and more accurately than any newspaper, without anyone who mattered noticing it was happening. By Thursday evening, Eliza had rough counts that told her between 60 and 80 people might come on Saturday. By Friday morning, the count was closer to 100. She did not tell Calder the full number. She wasn't sure why. Partly because the number felt fragile. People said they'd come and then didn't. That was the nature of it. Partly because she was afraid that if she said it out loud, some part of the thing would become real in a way that made the stakes feel heavier than she could currently afford. She was managing herself the way she managed the cattle in bad weather. Keep moving, stay warm, don't look too far ahead. On Friday afternoon, Calder rode to his northern homestead and came back with the last of his horses. 11 of them, in a string, coming down the ridge road in the winter light. She watched from the gate as he brought them in, and something about the sight of it, this quiet, deliberate man leading everything he owned down the road toward her property, because he'd said he would, and he meant it, sat in her chest in a way she didn't try to categorize. She opened the pasture gate for him. "All of them?" she said. "All of them." He brought the string through, and she latched the gate behind the last horse. He dismounted and started checking lead ropes. "I filed the household consolidation with the county authority this morning, officially on record as of today." "You closed the homestead filing?" "Submitted it." He looked at her. "It'll be processed Monday, but the submission date is today." She understood what that meant. If Silas made a move before Monday, and she believed he would, she'd been believing it all week, the filing date would show that the consolidation preceded whatever he filed. She hadn't asked Calder to think of this. He'd thought of it himself. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged once, in the way he had when he'd done something that seemed obvious to him, and he didn't understand why it required thanking. She'd come to find this quality both useful and, in a way she couldn't entirely justify, something that made her chest do the thing she wasn't cataloging. They spent Friday evening going through the documents one more time, organizing them into an order that told the story clearly. Original survey first, Prewitt's testimony second, the physical evidence of the stakes third, Beauchamp's name appearing across multiple fraudulent surveys fourth, and her father's account record last. The one that showed Beauchamp had been paid for a boundary consultation on this exact section and had taken that information directly to Silas. End to end, it was a complete picture. Not perfect. Nothing in life was perfect, and Eliza had stopped expecting it sometime around age 14, but complete. Thorough enough that refuting it would require Silas to explain things he would not want to explain in front of 100 people. "He's going to try to stop it," Calder said, looking at the organized stack. "He won't know about it until people start arriving." She tapped the stack into alignment. "Or he'll hear about it and come himself." "If he comes, good." She looked up. "If he comes, then everything happens in front of him, and he can't claim afterward that it was done in secret. If he stays away, the community decides without him." She paused. "Either way, the private room is gone." Calder looked at her for a moment. "You're not afraid of him," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm afraid of losing the land," she said. "I'm afraid of failing my father. I'm afraid of all the things that could go wrong tomorrow." She held his gaze. "I'm not afraid of him personally. He's a man who spent 30 years using legal machinery to take things from people who couldn't fight the machinery. The second you put it all in the open..." She stopped. "He's less than I thought he was." Calder was quiet for a moment. "Your father would have liked to see this." She felt the familiar tightening behind her eyes that she'd been managing for weeks. She pressed it down. "He would have had opinions about my methods," she said. "He didn't much like public confrontations." "No, but he liked winning." She almost smiled. It was the first time in several days that her face had done anything like that, and it felt strange and necessary simultaneously. Saturday came cold and clear, the way the best and worst days in Montana sometimes do. A sky so high and blue it looked like something painted on, the air sharp and carrying sound farther than you'd expect, so that you could hear a horse on the road a quarter mile before you saw it. Eliza was up at 5. She built the kitchen fire and made coffee and stood at the front window with her cup and watched the road. By 8 in the morning, the first wagons were coming. The Harkin family arrived together. Walter and his 2 sons and Walter's wife, who Eliza had met only twice, but who climbed down from the wagon and put her hand on Eliza's arm and said nothing, which was more than enough. The widow Carver came next. In a one-horse buggy she drove herself, and behind her came the Delaney brothers, which Eliza had not expected. James Delaney, the older of the two, caught her eye and gave her a nod that contained several things at once: acknowledgement, apology for the fence line withdrawal, something that might have been shame. She nodded back. She didn't have time for shame right now. That was something to process later. By 9 o'clock, there were 60 people on her property. By 9:30, there were closer to 90. Aldous Pruitt arrived at 9:15 on his bay horse, still moving with the unhurried precision of a man who had been the most reliable person in every room he'd entered for 60 years, and saw no reason to change that now. He tied his horse, accepted a cup of coffee from Calder without comment, and looked at the gathering crowd with an expression that was difficult to read and probably wasn't meant to be read. Eliza had set up in the yard beside the main barn, not inside, where people would feel enclosed and private, but outside, where the space was open and the southern pasture was visible in the distance, and anyone who looked could see exactly what she was talking about when she talked about it. She'd set out her father's maps on a wide board she and Calder had laid across 2 sawhorses. She'd pinned Pruitt's written testimony beside the original survey comparison. She had the piece of broken timber from the creek bank. She had her father's account record with Beauchamp's name on it. She was standing near the board, going over the order of things in her head for the 5th time, when she heard the shift in the sound of the crowd. That particular change in a group's noise when something unexpected arrives, not silence, but a different key. She looked up. Silas Crowder was coming through the gate. He had 4 men with him, not deputies this time, just his regular outfit, men who worked for him. He came in on his gray horse, and he looked at the gathered crowd, and his face did something she'd never seen it do before, which was struggle to remain neutral. It wasn't quite surprise. She suspected very little genuinely surprised him. It was more the expression of a man recalculating in real time, running through the options and finding each of them slightly worse than he'd prepared for. He dismounted. He handed his reins to one of his men. He walked toward the board in the yard with the careful, measured pace of someone who was buying time to think. Eliza let him come. She waited. She was aware of the crowd on all sides, aware of Calder standing to her left and Pruitt sitting on a fence rail to her right, aware of Walter Harkin and his sons near the back, and the widow Carver near the front, and 60, 70, 80 other people who had ridden out this morning to stand on her land and listen. Silas stopped about 10 feet from the board. He looked at the maps, at the documents, at Pruitt. He looked at Eliza. "This is a private property dispute," he said, loudly enough for the crowd to hear. He was smart enough to know the crowd was the audience, not her. "It's a matter for the county board, not a—" "The county board is made up of individuals who answer to this community," Eliza said. Not loudly, clearly. "And this community deserves to see what the board is being asked to decide. You're trying to— I'm going to show everyone here what's been done to this land," she said, "and I'm going to do it plainly, and then people can make up their own minds. That's all." Silas looked at her. She looked back. She did not break eye contact. She was terrified, in the specific and physical way of someone who is doing the most important thing they've ever done and knows that failure is a real option. But she was also entirely clear, which was a different thing from not being afraid and mattered more. She turned to the crowd. She started with her father's original survey, Pruitt's work from 1891, the boundary lines as they'd been established and re-established, the specific measurements of the Southern Creek boundary. She spoke without notes, because she'd been living in these documents for weeks and knew them the way she knew her own pastures. She showed people where the boundary was supposed to run, and she described, in concrete physical terms, how it had been moved and what that movement meant for the acreage count. Then she invited Pruitt forward. The old man got off the fence rail and came to the board with his notebook, and he spoke in the precise, unhurried manner of a man who has spent 60 years making sure he never said anything he couldn't back up. He described his original survey. He described what he'd found when he visited the southern pasture. He described the 14-degree deviation in the watercourse bearing, the excavation evidence, the time frame. He described, without being asked, the 2 other surveys he'd had questions about that bore Beauchamp's signature. The crowd was very quiet, not the quiet of disinterest, the quality of quiet that means people are listening so hard they've stopped doing anything else. Silas, to his credit, did not interrupt. He stood with his arms at his sides and his face arranged in neutral, and he let Pruitt speak, which told Eliza he was still calculating, still looking for the angle, and that made her more careful rather than less. When Pruitt finished, she produced her father's account record. She passed it to the front of the crowd so people could see it with their own eyes. Thomas Marlowe's handwriting, the date, the amount, the name. My father hired Beauchamp for a boundary consultation on the southern section, she said, 18 months ago, while my father was alive. Whatever information Beauchamp gathered on this property, boundary conditions, watercourse details, vulnerable points in the survey, he had access to all of it. She let that settle. 14 months ago, my father wrote to the county water authority asking questions about the southern boundary. He noticed something. By the time he was too sick to pursue it, someone had already begun redirecting the creek. The crowd was still very quiet. Then Walter Harkin spoke from the back. He didn't raise his hand first. He just spoke, in the flat, tired voice of a man who has been waiting 2 years for the right moment. He did the same thing to us, he said. The creek access on our eastern section. Beauchamp surveyed it, and then 3 months later we had a document from the county saying our access crossed Crowder land. He paused. It didn't. We'd been using that access for 20 years. Eliza did not look at Silas. She watched the crowd instead, watched the Delaney brothers exchange a look, watched two men in the middle, who she didn't know well, lean toward each other and say something low, watched Margaret Hale, who had come without her husband, stand very still with her arms folded. Someone else spoke. A man from the east side of the valley named Gunnarsson, who ran a sheep operation, unusual in cattle country, which meant he'd spent years being slightly peripheral to the main social structures of the community, which meant Silas had had less reason to cultivate him and less hold on him. There was an irrigation survey 2 years ago, Gunnarsson said. New access map for the northern feed. Beauchamp did it. The county registered it. 2 months later, I had a dispute filing from Crowder Land and Cattle saying I was drawing from a shared source they had rights to. He paused. I settled it because I couldn't afford not to. Signed over a secondary feed access. He looked at Silas. I've thought about that every week since. Silas moved. Not dramatically. He took a step forward and he raised his voice to something that wasn't quite a shout but carried. These are allegations, he said. You're standing here making accusations against me based on a survey dispute and an old man's testimony and a couple of disgruntled neighbors who lost property arguments years ago. He looked at the crowd, working it the way he'd worked rooms his whole life. I've built my operation legitimately, through legitimate means, for 30 years. One woman's bad feeling about a property restriction she doesn't like is not evidence of anything. The crowd was not as quiet now. She could hear the shifting. It's not a bad feeling, Eliza said. You're a grieving daughter who's looking for someone to blame for... My father's account record is not a feeling. Her voice came out very level, which cost her more than she showed. Aldous Prewitt's testimony is not a feeling. Walter Harkin's water access is not a feeling. Mr. Gunnarsson's irrigation rights are not a feeling. She stopped. The creek bank that was excavated and moved 15 feet on this property is something I can walk you out to and show you right now. She looked at the crowd. She looked directly at the people who'd come, ranching families, townspeople, the women from the sewing circle, men who'd known her father for decades. The territorial restriction that brought all of this to a head is an unjust law, she said. I believe that. But I didn't arrange my marriage to defraud anyone. I arranged it because the alternative was losing land my father spent his life building, and the only avenue the law left me was one that required me to find someone willing to stand beside me. She paused. Which he did. She did not look at Calder. She felt him behind her, steady, the way he always was. What I'm asking this community to see today is not just what was done to me. It's the method, the way a survey gets used, the way a water access gets disputed, the way the county machinery gets turned against people who can't afford to fight it indefinitely. She looked at the crowd. Some of you have already experienced this. Some of you may not know it yet, and some of you, and I know who you are, have been staying quiet because Silas Crowder has something you can't afford to lose. That last sentence landed like a stone in still water. She watched it move outward. James Delaney cleared his throat, but was not a small man physically, which seemed to help him with what he was about to do. We were told, he said slowly, that your deed was going to be under contest, that the board had already decided. He looked at the ground for a moment. Told it was decided and we should adjust accordingly. So we pulled our cattle off the shared fence line. He paused. We shouldn't have done that. No, Eliza said. You shouldn't have. Not hardly, just honestly. We'll move them back. Another silence. Then a woman's voice from the left side of the crowd. Eliza didn't immediately identify who, said, "My husband was told not to bring any survey disputes to Harlan's office. He was told it would go badly for him if he pushed." A pause. "He didn't tell me who told him that, but I think we all know." Silas's face was doing something now, still controlled, but the control was costing him. She could see it, the slight tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw was set with the particular effort of a man who has learned not to show anger and is currently very angry. He looked at Eliza. "You've made your speech," he said. "You've gotten your audience. But the board filing stands. The deed is in contested status. That doesn't change because you've gotten some neighbors worked up." "The board filing stands until the board meets," Eliza said, "and the board meets next week. At which point the members of this community who've been affected by the same pattern of survey manipulation and property pressure are going to present their own accounts to the board." She looked at him steadily. "Not just mine, all of them." Something moved in Silas's face then that she hadn't expected. Not fear, not quite. More like the expression of a man who has spent 30 years constructing something and has just seen it from the outside for the first time, seen what it actually looks like, and found the view uncomfortable. She pressed forward before he could recalculate. "Additionally," she said, "I'm requesting that the county surveyor's office conduct an independent review of all surveys filed by Beauchamp in the last 7 years. Any survey that shows boundary changes affecting properties adjacent to Calder Holdings." She looked at the crowd, not at Silas. "If I'm wrong, the review will show nothing. If I'm right—" She let that sit. Silas turned. He did it smoothly, the way he'd always moved, with the studied ease of a man who had practiced not showing defeat. He said something to the man holding his horse that Eliza couldn't hear. He mounted. He looked at her one more time from the height of the saddle, and she looked back, and they both understood that the room, the private room, the back corridor where he'd operated for 30 years, was gone. He rode out through the gate. His men followed. The sound from the crowd was not triumphant. It was something quieter and more complex. The sound of a large group of people exhaling simultaneously, the specific release of something that has been held too long. Eliza stood at the board and let it happen. She was shaking slightly, which she was glad nobody could see under her coat. She had not eaten this morning, she realized. She had forgotten entirely. Calder appeared beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, which was what she needed. Prewitt came forward and began carefully rolling up his survey documents. Margaret Hale came through the crowd and took Eliza's hand and pressed it once, firmly, without any other comment. Walter Harkin's older son came to stand near the board. "We should start writing accounts," he said. "Anyone who's had a dealing with Beauchamp or with Calder that we can put on paper. The more the board gets, the harder it is to dismiss any one of them as personal grievance." "I was going to suggest the same thing," Eliza said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "If people are willing to stay." "We're willing," James Delaney said from somewhere behind her. She turned and found him closer than she'd realized, his hat in his hands. He met her eyes without flinching. "We should have been willing a long time ago." They stayed for 3 hours. Not all of them, families with young children, people who had stock to get back to. But enough. Enough to fill several pages with accounts of water disputes and boundary filings and quiet pressures brought to bear through county channels over a period of years. The widow Carver turned out to have correspondence, actual letters, saved in a box because she'd always felt something was wrong and hadn't been able to say exactly what, that described a boundary inquiry on her property that connected to Beauchamp's name 2 years before her husband died. Eliza organized the accounts carefully, the way she organized everything, by property location, by date, by type of dispute. By the time the last people left in the early afternoon, she had a stack of written statements that was 3 inches thick. She stood in the yard after the last wagon left and looked at the gate, and at the road, and at the empty, cold, clear afternoon. She was exhausted in a way that went past tired into something that had no good word for it, the specific exhaustion of someone who has spent weeks operating at the edge of what they could do and has now done the thing and cannot yet fully account for what comes next. She heard Calder behind her. She didn't turn. "It worked," she said. Not triumphantly, quietly. "First part worked," he said, which she appreciated more than reassurance would have. He was right. The board was next week. Nothing was finished. "The accounts are strong," she said. "Between what we have from Prewitt, The documents and the community statements, they'll be hard to dismiss, if the board is honest. If, he said. He didn't pretend the if away. She was glad. She turned around. He was standing near the board they'd set up, which was still out in the yard, her father's map still pinned to it, moving slightly in the afternoon wind. He's going to do something before next week, she said. He's not done. No, he's not. Calder looked at the gate. But he's operating in the open now. Everything he does from here is visible. She nodded slowly. She thought about Silas on his gray horse, turning away from this yard with the studied ease of a man trying not to show what he'd just lost. She knew better than to count that as a victory, but she also knew that she'd been right about the private room. The moment you took it away, the man who'd lived in it was smaller, not harmless, smaller. She looked at the stack of community statements on the board. My father built this from 60 acres, she said. He never asked anyone for help in his life. Calder was quiet. I used to think that was a strength, she said. He looked at her. He seemed to be waiting, which was what he did when he thought someone had more to say and was giving them room to say it. She thought about it, about the kitchen full of neighbors, about Walter Harkin's wife's hand on her arm, about Gunnarsson the sheep farmer finally saying the thing he'd been holding for 2 years, about what it meant to stand in front of a community and be witnessed. He built something worth building, she said. I want to keep it. She paused. But I want to keep it differently than he did. Calder looked at her for a long moment. That sounds right, he said. She nodded once. She moved to start taking down the board. Leave it, Calder said. I'll do it. Go eat something. You haven't eaten since last night. She started to argue. Then she stopped herself because she was hungry and he wasn't wrong, and arguing for the sake of it was a habit she was trying to be more conscious of. All right, she said. She started toward the house. Then she stopped. Calder. He looked at her. She wanted to say several things. She didn't say any of them yet, not because she was afraid of them exactly, but because the day wasn't done and she needed to stay clear, and the things she wanted to say would require her to not be clear about something for the first time in as long as she could remember. Thank you, she said. For today. He gave her the look he always gave when he'd done something that seemed obvious to him. Go eat, he said. She went inside. She made herself something to eat, and she sat at the kitchen table and she looked at her father's map still on the board outside, visible through the window, moving in the wind. She thought about this board meeting next week and what Silas might do before then, and whether the community accounts would hold up under whatever pressure he brought to bear. She thought about all of it in the orderly, methodical way she thought about things that needed solving. And underneath all of that, running quiet and persistent like a creek under winter ice, was the thing she hadn't said yet. The thing that had been accumulating since frozen fences and bad biscuits and shared coffee cups on a morning shelf and a man riding 11 horses down a Winter Ridge road because he'd said he would. She knew what it was. She'd known for a while. She just wasn't sure yet whether she was brave enough for that particular truth. She'd been brave about a great many things in the last weeks, but this was a different kind of brave. The kind that had nothing to do with strategy or preparation or documentation. The kind that just required you to say the true thing. She sat with her food and the window and the maps moving in the wind, and she thought, not yet. There was still a board meeting. There was still Silas and whatever he had left. Not yet. But soon. Outside, Calder was taking down the board in the methodical, unhurried way he did everything, folding her father's maps carefully along the original creases. The way you handle something that belongs to someone and that you intend to give back exactly right. She watched him through the glass. She ate her food. She stayed at the table until the light changed. Silas moved on Tuesday. Eliza had expected Monday, so Tuesday felt almost like a gift. One extra day of preparation that she used to get Harlan on record with the community statements, to send a formal written request to the county surveyor's office regarding the independent review of Beauchamp's filings, and to make sure Prewitt's testimony was copied 3 times and stored in 3 separate locations, which was the kind of precaution that felt paranoid until the moment it didn't. The move Silas made was not what she'd anticipated. She'd been watching for another board filing, another legal instrument, something in the machinery he knew how to operate. What she got instead was a letter, delivered by Dorsey to the county clerk's office, and forwarded to Harlan, which requested that the board convene an emergency session to rule specifically on the question of marriage fraud before the regular Thursday meeting. The letter argued that proceeding to a standard deed review without first settling the validity of the marriage would waste the board's time and resources. Harlan sent her a copy with a note at the bottom. He's trying to separate the issues. Don't let him. She read it at the kitchen table while Calder ate breakfast across from her. She passed it to him without comment. He read it, set it down, and poured more coffee. He wants the board to rule on the marriage in isolation, he said, without the survey evidence, without the community statements, without any of the property fraud context. Because in isolation we look like exactly what he's been saying we are, Eliza said. Two people who made a legal arrangement and called it a marriage. Can he get an emergency session? Harlan thinks he has 2 of the 5 board members. He needs 3. She looked at the letter. Cole is the variable. He's the one I can't read. Cole had been the inspector who'd looked at the property and seen Calder's boots by the door and the 2 coffee cups, and had paused at the gate and said her father was a good man. She'd been turning him over in her mind for weeks, trying to determine which way he'd land when it mattered, and she kept arriving at the same answer, which was that she didn't know. I need to talk to him, she said. Calder looked at her. You're going to ask a county board member to show his hand before a vote. I'm going to have a conversation with a man who knew my father. She folded the letter. Those aren't the same thing. Cole lived on a property east of town, a modest place for a man of his position. A small house, a barn, 6 horses he bred for mountain work. He received Eliza at his front door with the expression of a man who had been expecting her, which told her something useful before she'd said a word. She came inside. She sat at his kitchen table. She did not bring documents. She'd thought about it and decided against it. Documents were for the boardroom. This was something else. He's going to request an emergency session to isolate the marriage question, she said. Cole looked at his coffee cup. I know. You know because he's already spoken to you. He speaks to a lot of people. Cole's voice was careful in the specific way of someone choosing every word as they go. That's not the same as me agreeing with him. No, she said. It isn't. She paused. Mr. Cole, I'm not going to pretend to you that my marriage to Calder Voss started as anything other than a practical arrangement. You're too smart for that, and I'm not in the habit of pretending. She held his gaze. What I will tell you is what I found in my father's records. What I'll tell you is that there is a pattern, not just my property, not just my family, a pattern of survey manipulation affecting multiple properties in this valley over several years, all connected to the same surveyor and the same beneficiary. And I'll tell you that separating the marriage question from that pattern is exactly what Silas wants because it lets him cut the thread before anyone can follow where it leads. Cole was quiet for a moment. He looked out his window. Your father filed a water inquiry 14 months before he died, he said. She went still. You knew about that. I processed it. I was working the Water Authority filings that season. He looked at her. I sent him a response that said there was no record of a boundary dispute on record, which was true at the time. A pause. 6 months later there was. A new survey had been filed by the county surveyor's office. Updated boundary map, Beauchamp's signature. And I should have flagged it. He said it flatly, without self-pity, but also without the false ease of someone who's made peace with something they haven't actually made peace with. I saw the timing was odd. I didn't push on it. I told myself it was a county matter and I was water authority. He stopped. Your father deserved better than that from me. Eliza sat with that for a moment. She felt the old anger move through her. The same anger she'd felt reading Beauchamp's name in her father's account records. But she didn't let it take over because Cole wasn't Silas, and regret wasn't the same as complicity even when it felt that way. Then help now, she said. Not for me, for the pattern. Because if it happened to my father and to the Harkins and to Gunnarsson and to the widow Carver's husband, it's not finished. It'll happen again to someone else who can't fight it. Cole looked at her for a long time. She didn't try to fill the silence. The emergency session request, he said finally. I won't support it. She nodded once. The Thursday meeting, he said. Bring everything. She rode home in the afternoon with something that was not quite relief. She'd stopped trusting the feeling of relief, which had a habit of arriving too early, but a settling of the ground under her feet, which was what she actually needed. She told Calder what Cole had said. He listened without interrupting. 3 days, he said when she finished. 3 days. He looked at the map on the kitchen wall, the one they'd put up during the blizzard weeks ago, her father's original survey pinned alongside the county version, the differences marked in her handwriting. It had stayed there because there was always a reason to reference it, and neither of them had suggested taking it down. I want to go through the community statements again tonight, he said. Organize them by the type of county process Silas used. Board filings separate from survey filings separate from water authority actions. The board is going to look for patterns the same way you did, and we should make it easy for them. I was going to do the same thing, she said. I know. He said it without irony. They'd gotten to the point where they often arrived at the same conclusion through parallel thinking, which she'd stopped finding surprising and started finding something else entirely. They worked that evening and most of the following day. It was in many ways like all the evenings they'd worked together at the kitchen table. The maps and documents spread out, the lamp burning, the fire in the stove, the particular rhythm of two people who have learned how each other thinks and have stopped needing to explain the intermediate steps. Except that Eliza was increasingly aware of a clock running underneath all of it. Not the legal clock, the other one. The arrangement had an end. That was what she'd promised him. A dissolution, filed on mutual incompatibility, clean and unbinding. She'd thought about it practically when she'd proposed it, which was the only way she'd known how to think about it then. She'd done her best not to think about it since. But Thursday was 3 days away, and then, one way or another, the legal reason for this arrangement would be resolved. And Calder had said, at the table, in the plain, uncluttered way he said things, that it had stopped being an arrangement for him a long time ago. He hadn't said it again. She hadn't responded to it. They'd both been operating by unspoken agreement in the understanding that there were things waiting on the other side of Thursday that couldn't be properly addressed before Thursday. She thought about that on Wednesday night, lying awake in the East Wing room, listening to the house settle and creak around her the way old houses do, the way the houses you grew up in do, and that you stop hearing until you start again. She thought about the dissolution papers that were in the desk drawer. She'd put them there 3 weeks ago when Harlan sent them over. She hadn't touched them since. She was still thinking about it when she heard Calder's boots quietly crossing the kitchen. Not pacing. He wasn't a pacer. Just moving, the way people move when sleep has refused them and the walls have gotten too close. She heard him open the back door and then close it behind him, and she lay there for another minute before she put on her coat over her clothes and followed. He was at the fence at the edge of the yard, looking out at the south pasture. The sky was clear, and there was just enough moon to see the frost on the ground, and the cattle were dark shapes in the far field, moving slightly. His horses were in the near pasture, 11 of them, his and hers together now, a fact that had settled into daily life with such naturalness that she'd almost stopped noticing it. Almost. She came to stand beside him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Can't sleep," she said. Not a question. Not much, no. She leaned on the fence rail. The cold was serious, but not cruel. The Montana winter could be either, and tonight it had chosen the version that just required you to dress for it. "I keep going through the board meeting," he said, trying to find the hole. "I've been doing the same thing." She paused. "I think the case is solid. I think Cole is solid. I think so too." He was quiet. "That's not actually what's keeping me up." She looked at him. He was looking out at the pasture. "Eliza." He turned to face her. In the cold and the moonlight, his face was very clear. Not the face of a man preparing a speech. Not the face of a man who was afraid of what he was going to say. Just the face of a man who had decided that the time for waiting had run its specific course. "I know we said after Thursday. I know there's still the board meeting and whatever Silas does between now and then. But I've been—" He stopped, tried again. "I'm not good at long speeches." "I know," she said. "The dissolution papers are in the desk drawer." "Yes." "I don't want to file them." The night sat around them. The horses moved in the near pasture, one of them making a low sound. Far off, a coyote said something to the dark that went unanswered. "Calder," she said. Her voice came out differently than she expected. Not controlled, the way it usually was, but something closer to honest, which she was discovering were not the same thing. I chose you because you were the only man in Raven Creek I trusted not to take something from me. I know, he said. You told me that the first night. I want to tell you the rest of it. She held his gaze. Somewhere between the cattle shed and the frozen irrigation ditch, and 3 days of blizzard and 4 nights of my father's records, and she stopped. I stopped being afraid of losing the land. He was very still. That's not true, she corrected herself. I'm still afraid of losing it, but it stopped being the thing I was most afraid of. She felt the exposure of saying it, the specific vulnerability of a person who has been entirely self-sufficient for a long time and is choosing not to be, which is terrifying in a way that no board meeting or legal threat has ever been. Losing you is the thing I'm most afraid of. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she felt the cold more acutely and the uncertainty that lived on the far side of honesty. Then he reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, the way he did everything, with a kind of quiet deliberateness that made it feel permanent rather than tentative. His hand was cold and work-roughened and entirely familiar, because she'd been watching those hands repair her fences and check her cattle and hold her father's maps for weeks, and they were not the hands of a stranger. I'm not going anywhere, he said, not as reassurance, as information. She held on to his hand and looked out at the pasture, at the horses that were his and hers, at the land that was her father's and her own, at the frost on the ground that would be gone by spring and replaced by grass she'd seen grow in every season of her life. The paper's in the desk, she said. We don't have to make any decisions tonight, he said. I know. She paused. I want to make a decision tonight. He looked at her. I'm not filing them, she said. That's my decision. She felt it land inside her the way real decisions do, not with fanfare, but with the specific settling of something that has been held at tension finally releasing. Whatever the board decides on Thursday, whatever happens with the land. She looked at him. My decision is you, and I want you to know that I'm saying it clearly, in those words, because I am aware of my history of not saying things clearly when they're personal rather than practical. Something moved in his face that she'd never quite seen before. Not the almost smile from the early weeks, not the focused stillness of someone solving a problem. Something warmer and more unguarded than either. Eliza Marlowe, he said. Voss, she said. At the moment. Eliza Voss, he said, and the way he said it was quiet and deliberate, the way he said everything that mattered. I've been in love with you since you walked into a blacksmith shop and told me you needed a husband before Saturday. She almost laughed. It came out as something between a laugh and a sound she didn't have a name for. That's a terrible time to fall in love with someone. Maybe. He wasn't letting go of her hand. Didn't ask for the timing. She looked at him for a long moment, the cold and the moonlight, and the horses moving in the near pasture, and everything that had accumulated between them over weeks of frozen ground and shared coffee and documents spread across a kitchen table. Neither did I, she said. They stood at the fence until the cold became genuinely persuasive, and then they went inside, and she did not think about Thursday for the rest of the night. The board meeting convened at 9 in the morning in the county hall, which was a plain, wood-framed building that smelled of old paper and coal smoke, and the specific institutional staleness of a space that had absorbed decades of difficult decisions. 5 board members sat at the long table at the front. Cole was second from the left, his face giving nothing away, which was what she'd expected and what she trusted. Silas was already there when Eliza and Calder arrived. He had a lawyer with him, a man Eliza didn't recognize, which meant he'd brought someone from outside Raven Creek, which meant he'd decided the local legal talent wasn't sufficient for what he was planning. That should have unnerved her. Instead, it told her he was taking this more seriously than he'd originally intended, which was a different thing entirely. The community had come. Not in the numbers from Saturday. This was a formal proceeding with limited seating, but enough. Walter Harkin and his older son sat in the second row. Prewitt was there, which had required him to make the 12-mile ride again in the cold, which he had done without being asked a second time. Francis from the sewing circle sat beside Margaret Hale. Gunnarsson, the sheep farmer, was against the back wall. The board chair, a man named Morrison, who Eliza had always found scrupulously fair in the specific way of someone who is fair because it is his job, rather than because it is his nature, called the session to order and outlined the matters before the board. the contested deed status of the Marlowe property, the marriage validity question, and what he described as ancillary matters regarding county survey records that had been submitted by multiple community members. Silas's lawyer stood up almost immediately. He was smooth, the practiced smooth of someone who'd been in many rooms like this, and who had the quality of making everything he said sound reasonable, which was its own kind of danger. He argued the marriage question first, and he argued it well. The public statements made at the time of the arrangement, the short window between proposition and signing, the admitted practical nature of the agreement. He called 2 witnesses, men Eliza recognized as having been in or near the blacksmith shop the evening she'd walked in, who testified to the words she'd used. "I need a husband before Saturday." It landed the way it was meant to. Eliza did not look at the board. She looked at Calder, who was sitting beside her with his hands on the table and his face still, and she thought, we knew this part was coming. She'd known it from the moment Silas had said it on the porch in the dark. The words were real. The context was everything. When it was her turn, she stood and spoke directly to the board. "Everything Mr. Crowder's witnesses have said is accurate," she said. "I did say those words. I did approach Calder Voss with a practical proposal. I did use language that described it as an arrangement." She paused. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you that a marriage born of necessity is the same as one that isn't. I don't think you'd believe me, and I wouldn't be able to say it honestly." She looked at Morrison. "What I'm going to tell you is that what happens between 2 people over weeks of shared hardship, shared work, and shared stakes is not always predictable. And what I'll tell you is that the relevant question before this board is not how the marriage started. It is whether it is, as of today, a genuine household." She produced the household consolidation filing, the Joint Water Authority registration, the cattle herd combination record, the survey of the Northern Homestead showing its official closure, dated last Friday. "Every one of these was filed voluntarily," she said, "before this meeting, before we knew what would be presented here today. They are the actions of people who made a decision about their lives that has nothing to do with county board timelines." She sat down. Calder spoke briefly when asked. The board addressed him directly, which she hadn't known they would do, and he answered without preparation and without drama. Had he been present in the Marlowe household as a genuine resident for the duration of the marriage? Yes. Had he consolidated his assets and filed his homestead closure voluntarily? Yes. Did he consider this a genuine marriage? He looked at Morrison and said, "Yes, I do." 3 words, in the tone of a man who doesn't elaborate on things that are simply true. Morrison asked no follow-up. Then Eliza put the property fraud evidence before the board. This part took 2 hours. Prewitt testified for 40 minutes, going through the survey comparison with the precision and unhurried authority of a man who has earned the right to take his time in any room he chooses. Harlan submitted the community statements as a formal package, 31 accounts, organized by property location and type of dispute, covering 7 years. Cole, when asked by Morrison to speak to the water authority aspect, described the sequence of events around Thomas Marlowe's water inquiry and the subsequent survey filing, and he described it accurately, including the part where he should have pushed harder and didn't. That last part stopped the room. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was so plainly honest, a county official describing his own failure in a public proceeding, that the room simply had to absorb it. Silas's lawyer objected 3 times during the property fraud testimony. Morrison overruled twice and sustained once on a technical point regarding hearsay, which the lawyer had clearly identified in advance and was using to limit the Gunnarsson testimony. Eliza had anticipated this and structured the community statements so that Gunnarsson's account was corroborated by documentary evidence rather than standing alone, which the lawyer had not fully anticipated and which showed on his face, briefly, before he reassembled his smooth. Silas sat through all of it with his controlled face and his careful posture, and he did not speak. His lawyer did the speaking. That was the right call, and she knew it. Anything Silas said directly, under the conditions of a formal board proceeding, could be used in ways that his lawyer couldn't fully protect him from. So he sat and let the lawyer manage it, and the lawyer did a capable job of managing it, and none of that changed what the board was looking at. Morrison called a recess at noon. An hour. People went out into the cold, ate what they'd brought, stood in small groups talking in the specific low-key way of a community that has just witnessed something significant and is still calibrating what it means. Eliza stood outside with Calder and ate the biscuits she'd made that morning, which were better than her early attempts but still not good. He ate his without comment, which she appreciated. Cole was solid, Calder said. Yes. The lawyer's going to argue the community statements are coordinated, that we organize people to present a unified account. We did organize people to present a unified account. Right, but the accounts themselves are independently verifiable. Yes. She looked out at the street. Silas's lawyer was near the hall door, speaking quietly to one of the board members she didn't know well. Not Cole, not Morrison, one of the three she'd been less certain about. She watched the body language of the conversation. The board member nodding, not in agreement exactly, more in the way of someone absorbing a point. The lawyer making a shape with his hands that indicated proportion, scale. This is a small matter. Don't make it larger than it is. She turned away. She couldn't control that conversation. She'd put in front of the board what she'd had to put in front of them, and now it was in their hands, which was the hardest possible place for something to be when you were Eliza Marlowe. Whatever they decide today, she said, about the marriage question, it'll stand, Calder said. You don't know that. No. He looked at her. But I know the household registration and the herd consolidation and the homestead closure are on public record, regardless of what this board decides. A county board ruling on marriage validity doesn't undo filed registrations. If he wants to push further, he has to go to a territorial court, which takes months and requires evidence of fraud that the public record contradicts at every point. He paused. He can keep fighting, but it gets harder, not easier, from here. She looked at him. When did you figure all of that out? Last week. I asked Harlan. She shook her head slightly. You didn't tell me. You had enough in your head. He said it simply. I didn't want to add something that was just backup planning, in case we needed it. She thought about that. About the specific kindness of someone managing the things around the edges so you can keep your focus on the center. She'd never had that before. She hadn't known how much it cost the person doing it until she thought about it from the outside. Thank you, she said. He gave her the look. She held up a hand before he could tell her to go eat something. I know, she said. You know. He almost smiled. The board reconvened at 1 in the afternoon. Morrison read the ruling without preamble, which was the most nerve-shredding quality of the man. He didn't telegraph, didn't build, just delivered. The marriage validity challenge was denied. The board found, by a vote of 4-1, that the documentary evidence of genuine household consolidation was sufficient to satisfy the territorial requirement and that the circumstances of the marriage's origin were not, in the board's determination, disqualifying. The restriction had been met. The deed contest was suspended pending the county surveyor's independent review of boundary surveys filed by Beauchamp in the preceding 7 years. The independent review was ordered. It would cover all surveys affecting properties adjacent to Crowder Holdings. Morrison set down his paper. The board also notes, he said, in the tone of someone adding something that has been specifically discussed, that the territorial restriction cited in this case is under formal review for repeal at the next legislative session, following a petition submitted by 17 ranching families in this county. He looked at no one in particular. The board is in support of that petition. The room was not silent. It was the specific sound of people not staying quiet, the exhale and the low talk and the movement that says something is over, something has shifted, something that was wrong has been, in however partial and complicated a way, acknowledged. Eliza sat very still for a moment. Then Calder's hand was on her arm, and she looked at him. And what she felt was not triumph, and it was not relief, and it was not the particular satisfaction of having fought something and won, though it was all of those things too. It was larger than any category she had for it, and she made no attempt to categorize it. She just let it be what it was. Silas Crowder left the building without looking at her. His lawyer followed, already speaking quietly, probably already laying out the next possible moves, the territorial court option, the appeal process, all the remaining machinery. Silas would use some of it. She knew him well enough to know that he wouldn't stop entirely, that men like him rarely did, that the project of diminishment was so built into how he operated that he might not know how to move through the world without it. But the independent review was ordered. And once that review was done, once Beauchamp's work was formally examined across 7 years and multiple properties, the machinery stopped being Silas's to control. That was the thing he couldn't take back. Walter Harkin shook her hand. His older son shook Calder's. Prewitt came through the thinning crowd and stopped in front of Eliza and looked at her for a long moment with those sharp old eyes. "Your father would have made a fuss," he said. She almost laughed. He hated public scenes. He did. Prewitt picked up his canvas bag. He also would have been proud. He just would never have said it in those words. He paused. "I'm saying it for him." She held that. It was an uncomfortable thing to hold, the kind that makes your chest tight and your eyes do things you'd rather they didn't. She held it anyway. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." He nodded. He left. 82 years old, bad ear, 12 miles home, and he didn't make anything of any of it. The weeks that followed were not tidy. Life on a cattle ranch in winter is never tidy, and the legal aftermath of a board ruling was no exception. The independent surveyor's review was confirmed and scheduled for February. Two of Silas's former business partners in the valley quietly ended their arrangements with Crowder Land and Cattle. Not announced, not dramatic, just the gradual withdrawal of people who have decided which side of a line they're standing on. Beauchamp disappeared from county work, his contract quietly not renewed, which was not the accounting that justice demanded, but was more than nothing. Walter Harkin's water access dispute was formally re-examined. The territorial restriction repeal petition moved forward. None of this happened fast. Most of it was still unfolding in the early spring when the grass came back and the cattle rotation started again, and life became primarily about the land, which was as it should be. Eliza and Calder did not file the dissolution papers. They talked about what they were instead, not in one long conversation, but in the accumulated way that people who are good at working together and discovering they are also good at living together tend to sort things out. Bit by bit, in the kitchen in the evenings, or riding out to check fences in the morning, or at the end of a day when the work was done and the house was warm and there was no particular urgency, and they could say what was true without needing it to fit a category. What was true was simple, even when it had been complicated to get to. They wanted the same life, the same land, the same table. The dissolution papers eventually came out of the desk drawer. Eliza burned them in the stove, not ceremonially. There was nothing ceremonial about it. She just dropped them in because they were paper taking up space, and she was done with them. Calder was at the table when she did it, and he looked up from the account ledger and back down without comment, which was exactly right. In May, Harlan sent a formal notice confirming the unconditional transfer of the deed. 240 acres, Eliza Marlowe Voss, sole owner. She read it at the table and set it down and sat with it. "It's done," she said. Calder looked up. "The deed." She pushed it across the table. He read it. He set it back down. "How does it feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned from him to answer questions that deserved honest answers. "Like a weight I've been carrying so long that I forgot I was carrying it," she said. "And now it's just my land, not contested, not threatened, just mine." He nodded. "Ours," she said. "If that's—" "It is," he said. Simple as that. They expanded the cattle operation that summer, sold the northern homestead, not because they needed the money for survival, but because they were planning together now, and the plan had a shape to it, and the shape included a third pasture and a new breeding program in horses, enough to be known for both horses and cattle, which was what Calder had been quietly building toward before circumstances had redirected him to her gate. The sale price went into the operation, and the operation grew, not fast, not glamorously, but with the steady accumulation of two people who knew what they were doing and were doing it together. Raven Creek watched. That was what small communities do. They watch, and they adjust their understanding when the evidence requires it. The community that had questioned, in whispers and sideways glances, and the pointed absence of certain invitations, whether Eliza Marlowe could manage 240 acres alone, adjusted its understanding in the way that communities do when they have been definitively shown to be wrong, which is slowly, without full acknowledgement, by gradual behavioral shift. The invitations came. The respect followed. It was not dramatic, and it was not complete, and it was not owed. She hadn't done any of this to earn approval, and she knew the difference between approval that's given because you've earned it and approval that's given because you've made it impossible to withhold. She didn't lose sleep over which kind this was. The second wedding was small. A cold morning in December, Harlan as a witness, Prewitt as the other. He'd insisted. And at 82, you don't argue with someone who insists. Margaret Hale came, and Francis, and Walter Harkin and his family. No ceremony to speak of. A brief exchange of words that were their own rather than borrowed from a script. Eliza wore a dress she'd had for years, not new, not white. Practical enough to be worn again, which she fully intended to do. Calder said, when it was his turn, "I'm not going anywhere." She'd heard him say it before. She heard it differently now. Not as reassurance, not as promise, but as simple fact. The kind of fact that doesn't require ceremony or repetition, but that settles into the foundation of things and stays. She said, "Neither am I." Harlan signed the paper. Prewitt witnessed it with the particular satisfaction of an old man who has lived long enough to see certain things come right and is glad to still be around to see this one. They went home in the afternoon. There was still cattle work to do, there always was, and they did it. Eliza handled the afternoon rotation while Calder brought in the horses from the north pasture. They ate supper at the kitchen table where her father's maps had once been spread out in the urgency of crisis, and which was now just a table, the best kind of just a table, ordinary and warm and permanent. The sign above the gate was Calder's idea. He'd made it in the blacksmith shop one evening, the same shop, the same forge, where she'd walked in on a dark night with 9 days left and a problem that seemed impossible. He'd brought it home wrapped in canvas and hung it on the gatepost without making anything of it, and Eliza had seen it the next morning when she went out for the early check. Marlowe Voss Ranch. Both names, equal size. Her name first because it was the name on the original deed and on the original title and on the family history that ran under the ground of this place like a root system, and because Calder had understood that without being told. She stood at the gate for a long time that morning, looking at the sign. The frost was thick on the ground and the sky was early gray and the cattle were beginning to move in the far field, which meant she had things to do. She knew she had things to do. She stood there anyway. There is something that happens when you have fought for something with everything you have and you find, at the end of it, that what you were fighting for was larger than you'd known at the start. You set out to save 240 acres from a man who thought laws and money were the same thing as power. You end up understanding something about what it costs to hold a thing alone and what it means to hold it with someone. About the difference between independence that isolates and independence that chooses, that looks at another person and says, "Of all the options available to me, I choose you, not because I have to, not because the law requires it, not because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't, but because wanting is a reason, and I want this." Eliza Marlowe had spent her life being practical. She'd learned practical from her father, and she'd refined it through years of calving seasons and account ledgers and fences that broke at exactly the wrong time. Practical had served her. She didn't disown it. But there was something that practical couldn't account for, and she'd found it in the most impractical way, walking into a blacksmith shop with a problem that couldn't be solved, and finding a man who said, "When do we sign?" and meant, as it turned out, considerably more than the words. She didn't think about it in those terms at the time. She was only beginning to think about it now, standing at the gate on a cold morning with the sign above her and the land behind her and the sound of Calder moving in the barn. Some things take the time they take. She turned away from the gate and walked toward the barn, because there was work to do, and she'd stood there long enough and the cattle weren't going to rotate themselves. Calder looked up when she came in, and she looked back at him, and nothing was said, because nothing needed to be said. And that was, of all the things she'd come to value in the last year, the list was long and surprising and had changed her more than she'd expected. That was perhaps the thing she valued most. Not the land. Not the deed with her name on it. Not the sign above the gate with both their names. The quiet that didn't need filling. The person standing in it. Years later, when the county land board asked Eliza Voss to sit on a committee reviewing the remaining territorial property restrictions, there were 3 left on the books, all of them variants on the same basic principle that a woman alone was an administrative problem to be solved by adding a man. She said yes before they finished asking. She served on the committee for 4 years. She was not the loudest voice on it, and she was not always the most persuasive, And there were days when the process moved so slowly that she drove home in a state of frustration that Calder learned to identify from the way she closed the truck door. On those evenings, he made the coffee. He did not offer advice unless she asked, which she usually did eventually, after she'd worked the frustration down to something manageable. One evening, she came home after a particularly difficult committee session and sat at the kitchen table and said, "We're going to get it done. It's going to take another 2 years and it's going to be infuriating the entire time, but we're going to get it done." Calder set a cup in front of her. He sat down across from her. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You don't have any doubt about that?" "No." "Why not?" He considered it. He was not a man who gave quick answers to questions that deserved slow ones. "Because I've watched you work," he said, "and I know the difference between someone who's doing something because they have no choice and someone who's doing something because they've decided it's the thing that needs doing." He paused. "You decided." She held his gaze. She thought about a blacksmith shop in the dark, 9 days on a clock, a decision made out of desperation that turned into something she couldn't have planned and wouldn't trade. "Yes," she said. "I did." The land outside was the same land it had always been. The grass came back every year, and the cattle worked the rotation, and the horses moved in the far pasture, and the creek ran along the southern boundary where Prewitt's original survey said it should run. The banks reinforced in the spring after the board ruling, restored to the line her father had built and her grandfather before him. Above the gate, in all weather, the sign. Marlowe Voss Ranch. Both names. Permanent as the fence posts, solid as the ground beneath them. The kind of thing you build when you stop fighting alone.